Ben Johnson staying in Detroit? What does that mean for the Houston Texans? And Davis Mills, Brandin Cooks, current players on the roster that can really shake things up for the Houston Texans offseason.
You are Locked On Texans, your daily Houston Texans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to a Thursday episode of the Locked On Texans podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of the Locked On Texans podcast is presented by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players. If they score more or less than their Prize Pick projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked In. Cody and I are discussing the Houston Texans, and I'm sorry, guys. I'm John Hickman, of course, joined by Cody Davis, and one of the candidates for the Houston Texans' vacant head coaching position job, Ben Johnson, has informed teams, which includes the Texans, that he is staying in Detroit. He believes that they have something special, and he wants to see it through. That leaves Houston with Sean Payton, Mike Kafka, defensive coordinator for the Broncos, Ejiro Evero. Also, the Houston Texans did complete an interview with Thomas Brown, the LA Rams assistant head coach and tight ends coach. And then there is D'Amico Ryan's name is still floating out there as well. So Ben Johnson is out. Still got to get that vacancy filled. Cody, how do you feel about that move? Looking at Ben Johnson wanting to stay in Detroit, and does this really take a huge effect on this vacancy for Houston?
I wonder how much this news of Ben Johnson taking his name out of the running, is it more so him wanting to stay in Detroit, or is it more so the fact that the Houston Texans might already have their top 2, top 3 candidates? And once again, we talked about this on yesterday, playing around with the idea early on in the week. Every single day is looking more and more likely that the Texans are trying to position themselves to make a run at Sean Payton. I know when the Texans first started their head coaching search at the time, I was told by a source that Jonathan Gannon was the front runner, which made perfect sense because, before they took a turn and went with Lovie Smith last year, and before the whole Josh McCown foolishness, if you guys don't remember, Jonathan Gannon was the top candidate for the Houston Texans last year. So, every single head coaching vacancy in the NFL, it always seems like they interview somewhere in the ballpark 6 to 8 candidates, but we always know that it's always at least 3 candidates who have a genuine chance to get the job as the head coach of that particular franchise. And of course, here we're talking about the Houston Texans. I'm looking at this from a standpoint. I just mentioned 2 names. That third name most likely has to be D'Amico Ryans. And I think this is probably more so Ben Johnson just looking at this from a standpoint. I know it's a long shot for me to get this job, so I'm going to go ahead and take my name out and stay in Detroit and continue building my resume and hopefully get another opportunity next year.
Yeah, man. And I just want to say this in terms of just football talk. I love it for Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was critical in helping rejuvenate quarterback Jared Goff when he took over the passing game last season and continued as the offensive coordinator this season. Critical in helping out Amon St. Brown, right? Critical in the success that TJ Hockenson has praised him for, who is now in Minnesota. And I think that he looks at this offense with a Jamal Williams, a DeAndre Swift, and now that he's going to get a full offseason of Jameson Williamson, and he's looking at it like, you know what, man? Yeah. I have an opportunity here to really create something special. And when it's time, when it's opportunity rolls around again, my resume may be even more stamped than what it is right now. So in terms of football, and talking football, I love it. In terms of the Houston Texans, it's not a worry. Ben Johnson was the guy that I really liked for this franchise to move forward with. However, as we've been talking about throughout the week, Sean Payton has been doing a very good job going on a media tour himself and lobbying for himself to be the Houston Texans' next head coach. They still have the likes of Mike Kafka. You talked about just now Jonathan Gannon. They still have quality candidates out there. So it isn't like a last offseason where, let's say, it came down to Ben Johnson and I'm not trying to take digs at the man, Lovie Smith. And now that Ben Johnson is out, you have to ride with Lovie Smith. It's not like that. Ben Johnson is out, but you still have what we named our show a couple of days ago, the cream of the crop out there. And the best part about it is you don't have to fight against other franchises to get a head coach. There's not that many head coaching vacancies, so it's limited opportunities, but you still have the best of the best available for the position. So I'm okay with it. Kudos to Ben Johnson for feeling like Detroit is home. Detroit is where he wants to be. Detroit is where he feels like he can really bring something different to the game, a stamp on the game for his own career needs and future and what he wants to do. But this isn't a panic moment for Houston like it was the last two off seasons. You still have the opportunity to get it right, fix the culture, change the franchise, and be competitive in the next following seasons. BetOnline is your number one source for all of your sports betting information, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college basketball, the World Cup, they've got it all over at betonline.net. And if you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to find all of your betting information. So head over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more, because BetOnline is where the game starts.
Welcome back in, ladies and gentlemen, to this Thursday installment of Locked On Texans. And because there's been so much going on with the Houston Texans, with the head coaching search, with Lovie Smith getting fired and everything else in between, me and John really didn't have an opportunity to really talk about some storylines for this organization beyond the draft, beyond the head coaching search, going into the 2023 offseason. And we got to talk about the main two guys. And yes, I understand. What 3-13-1 record? I still get confused when I try to say their record. It's really not much to take away, but I do believe that we have to have an opportunity to talk about what is next for people like Brandin Cooks and for Davis Mills. And John, I want to start this segment off talking about, what is next for Brandin Cooks, because as we all know, Cooks came to the Houston Texans in March of 2020. He came here. He thought that he was going to play alongside Deshaun Watson. We already know the story. He came out and said, after they went 4-12, came out and said he wasn't accepting any more trades. He's all for the rebuild with his organization. We all know what went on with Deshaun Watson. He basically became a one-man band. He embraced the rebuild this past offseason, signed a 2-year extension, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in the ballpark to $25 to $30 million. And for the first half of the season, gave a lot of prep talk as to why he believed in Nick, and to why he believed in Lovey, and to why he believed in Jack Easterby. And as soon as Jack Easterby goes out the door, all of a sudden, he starts showing his quote unquote butt, for a better term. But now
misspelling words like dishes
on Twitter. But now, John, I kind of feel like Brandin Cooks is at a crossroad in his career. And before moving on, during the final day of the Houston Texans season, when they had an opportunity to clean out their locker, Brandin Cooks talked about his future, or lack thereof, with this organization.
You said get my mind right. For me, my mind's not there. Rebuild, like I said, that window of where your gifts are at its peak only lasts for so long. So for me, I'm not looking at it as far as being a part of a rebuild. However that looks, that's where I trust my camp and my representation to be able to get a map from here and to there to see what that looks like, to be a part of something that's a trusted plan. But I'm not going into this offseason thinking like I want to be a part of another rebuild like that. Honestly, the way I think about it is I hope that I loved everybody in this building the best way that I can. Forget the the football piece of it. Obviously, every time I put that uniform on, I played my heart out for this organization, these fans, and it's unfortunate we couldn't get anything done my 3 years here. But when I walk away and I leave throughout the off season, I just wish and I hope everyone felt the love for me and everyone understood that I try to be the best leader I can possibly be in a situation that we've been in. Obviously, it hasn't been pretty. There's been a lot of things going on, these last 3 years. I had fun doing it, but that's my prayer that I loved everyone in this building and they felt that.
Before moving on, John, before I give the floor over to you, I do want to say this. In 2023, as we mentioned, Brandin Cook's been taking a lot of heat because he signed a contract with this organization. He's all
22.
for the rebuild. Well, 2022, he signed the contract. He's all for the rebuild. And now it seems like, well, not seem like, he wants out of town. In terms of me kind of taking up for Brandin Cooks, I don't fault him for that because I view Brandin Cooks in the same situation as I view Eric Gordon. And speaking of Houston Rockets, that is part of the reason why John and myself are recording this Thursday podcast a hell of a lot earlier than we normally do because I had to go cover the Rockets versus Charlotte Hornets game at the Toyota Center. Hopefully by the time you guys hear this, they end the 11-game losing streak. But I say all that just to say, when you have a veteran like Brandin Cooks, like Eric Gordon, who are all for the rebuild, all for laying down a new foundation, all for helping the young guys on the team, they are not expecting to get into year 3, year 4 of a rebuild. And in some cases, you are just as bad, if not worse off than you was at the start of the rebuild. And I do believe that is where Brandin Cooks' frustration lies with this organization. However, Brandin Cooks made that statement about 2 weeks ago. Ever since then, we heard from Nick Caserio, and it seems like there's a new tone, new demeanor in him as a general manager. Not only that, there's a new tone and demeanor for this organization. Plus, you also got to consider that the Houston Texans have put together a very significant and great list of head coaching candidates. And one of those coaches is Sean Payton. Brandin Cooks spoke highly of Sean Payton over the years. John, I would not be surprised if Brandin Cooks tried to mend his relationship with this organization if they have an opportunity to bring in Sean Payton. Now, before I give the floor over to you, I do want to mention this. I was told that Brandin Cooks and Nick Caserio, even though things got a little ugly at the trade deadline, they still have respect for each other and there is no bad blood. So I do believe if there is still no but bad blood, there might be a small chance that he might come back to this organization.
I got to question whether or not it's worth it. And I do want to say this. Maybe what played a huge factor in Ben Johnson staying in Detroit is maybe there is a strong possibility and feeling around the league that Sean Payton in Houston is pretty much almost a done deal. So why waste my time?
Mm-hmm.
But to get back to Brandin Cooks, it could be a possibility. I think that with everything that happened last season, frustrations was at an all-time high.
Mm-hmm.
And like the tweets from Brandin Cooks and near deadline trade that fell through for him going to Dallas, that didn't happen, and missing games and not being the captain anymore. Everything that played out, it just seems like why keep that around? But to Brandin Cooks' point, I don't think Brandin Cooks really wants to be a part of a nasty rebuild that is regressing. Brandin Cooks was okay in year 1 under David Culley because that was the first year of the rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When he first got to Houston, he had Deshaun Watson, didn't win many games in his last year with Deshaun. So that wasn't considered a rebuild. That following year under David Culley, that was a rebuild. And as a player who, by the way, was getting paid pretty handsomely here in Houston, you may have looked at that as, okay, I get it. I understand it, especially considering what just took place. So now you're going into the second year, and the talk around the franchise is we're not actively tanking, where we want to be better. And the team regressed, and the regression was terrible to look at times in year 2 of the rebuild under Lovie Smith. And so for Brandin Cooks, it's like, hey, man, if you guys remember, I'm not covering up for the lies no more. Remember that? I think that was a part of it. The ideal that this team would be more competitive this year under a Super Bowl contending, formerly contending head coach in Lovie Smith compared to a lifelong coordinator coach. Didn't work out. The tweets, the emotions, everything like I just mentioned. So if Sean Payton comes in and there is a change in infrastructure and how this franchise is being ran in terms of roster, in terms of coaching, in terms of how everything can completely change, do a 180. And by the way, the Houston Texans schedule came out. That schedule for this upcoming season looks a little bit more easier than its past 2 schedules, right? So that could play a factor in it. And you having a relationship with Sean Payton being one of those respected coaches throughout the league, which may change some of the minds of some of these players doing free agency. So now the roster looks better. Now the roster has more competitive players for Brandin Cooks, who, by the way, is still getting paid very handsomely. I mean, like almost handsome as me, right? That could change your mind. That could change the trajectory of your idea of staying in Houston for another season under contract, because now not only are they telling you it'll be different, but they're also actively showing you and putting into action that the next 17 games that you play will be completely different compared to the past 33 games that you've played for the Houston Texans franchise.
And I do want to clarify something. I don't want nobody thinking that I'm lobbying for Brandin Cooks to stay. Even if they do bring in Sean Payton, I do feel, John, to your point, that it might be best for this organization to move on from Cooks. However, you still got to consider the fact that Cook still has a lot of money left on that contract. And not only that, even though he is not the player that he once was, and I do believe that this was the first year that Cooks really started showing some type of decline, what is going to be a fair asking price for the Texans, and what is going to be a fair trade package that the Texans get back for his services? I think there's just a lot that you got to consider as to what is next for Brandin Cooks. And like I mentioned, I was told that him and general manager Nick Caserio, they still have a pretty good relationship.
And Nick has had, from what we've both been told about several situations, Nick has never been the villain. It's always been, other powers.
Yeah.
So I don't look at Nick being here in town as a bad thing, as a deterrent compared to something that may be helpful. As we sit and talk about toxic relationships, I want to tell you about a healthy relationship that can really make a huge difference in your life, and that's Built Bar. Built Bar is a protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. So right now, you can go to built.com and use promo code LOCKEDON15, and you'll get 15% off your next order. You can also find Built Bar at your local Walmart or Sam's Club. So again, visit builtbar.com and use promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off your next order.
Welcome back in, ladies and gentlemen, to this Thursday installment of Locked On Texans. John and myself, we just had a really good conversation about what is next for Brandin Cooks. Now we got to look into what is next for quarterback Davis Mills. As you guys know, Davis Mills regressed in his second season.
There's some people out there. Get him out of here. Trade him.
Yeah, you got people out there, just cut him, get him out of here, whatever the case might be. You got some people that are saying that, they would like to see Davis Mills stick around because, you never know what the future holds. And, I saw this one idea, of course, knock on wood, that, you get Bryce, you get CJ, something happens within their first season and they're unable to play. I don't want to say what that is, but just think back to Deshaun Watson's rookie season after that phenomenal performance against the Seattle Seahawks. And the very next day or 2 days later in practice, he ended up tearing something and was out for the rest of his rookie season. So I saw a lot of people saying, that could be your security blanket if you have to change quarterbacks mid-season. He could step in and just try to help keep the organization afloat. John, and as he should, Davis Mills feels like he has done enough to retain his job. And not only that, he feels that if given the opportunity, he can still develop into the quarterback people like myself and the rest of the Mill Mafia was hoping for.
Continue development. Obviously, get in whatever playbook I am given this upcoming season as quick as possible so I can start winning some people over and try to get another opportunity to go out there and be the guy next year.
Davis,
and continue to just progress as a quarterback, continue working on fundamentals, and make sure I can go out there and perform to my best ability given the opportunity.
Davis, from your seat, do you feel like you did enough this year to show the organization that you deserve to be the guy, no questions asked, going into next year? Or?
I hope so. I mean, obviously there's always going to be questions asked. I'm not in full control of that decision, but I'd like to think to myself that I'd shown enough, and I think personally that my best football is still ahead of me, so I want to continue developing and growing as a player and as a person.
As you guys know, like I mentioned, Davis Mills regressed in his second season. I believe he finished the season tied for first place for the most interceptions on the season with 15. He tied with Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott. And John, I think it's going to be real interesting to see what is next for Davis Mills, because even though it did not work out here in Houston, I do believe that he possesses the attributes to be a quality starting quarterback in this league, and maybe more so than Brandin Cooks. I believe that it might be in Davis Mills's best interest to depart from this organization and get a new slate somewhere else. That way you can have a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator, just a new everything, and a new franchise who believes in you. Because the one thing that I kept thinking about last week and even early on this week before we got the news that CJ was declaring for the draft, I kept thinking to myself, what will the Houston Texans look like, for the sake of this argument, if CJ stayed in college, Bryce Young get taken by the Indianapolis Colts, and the Houston Texans are kind of cornered into a realistic possibility of giving Davis Mills another opportunity? I still think Davis Mills can thrive, but I believe he would just do better going to a franchise that believes in him.
So first and foremost, I would like to say that if we look directly to San Francisco, they have quote unquote Mr. Irrelevant throwing four touchdowns in the playoff game, right? And has been on a mean streak. I think he has like 17 touchdowns since.
I think he's 6-0 too.
He's 6-0, 17, like crazy numbers for the amount of time he's been playing football. And you guys have either seen me tweet it or I've come on this show and sung praises about Kyle Shanahan. So what I'm getting at is coaching matters. You get caught up on the hype of a first round, quarterback who was, taken first overall, and you get hype about that. Well, if Brock Purdy isn't a perfect example of coaching matters, Geno Smith just broke the Seattle Seahawks passing yards record in his first year with the franchise starting. Coaching matters. And so to bring that around to what's next for Davis Mills, I think we can agree that the Houston Texans' next head coach, unless it's Jonathan Gannon, who I'm against, their next head coach will be monumental for the growth of their rookie quarterback when they draft him. And I think that same help and that same coaching that will help that rookie quarterback is going to help third-year quarterback Davis Mills. And so I also want to take a trip to Philly, right? Jalen Hurts go down. What did you see? Gardner Minshew stepped in. Now, did Gardner Minshew just necessarily go crazy and win a bunch of games? No, I think Gardner Minshew only played in 2 games, maybe 3. I can't remember the number off top. But that first game against Dallas, that offense didn't necessarily look any different. Gardner Minshew is a quarterback that has been in the league for a few years and has been in a couple of different systems, but he's learned how to make it work. And whenever his time has been called, I think Gardner Minshew has played up to a standard enough where this offseason teams may come calling for the possibility of you being our next starting quarterback for this upcoming season if we don't necessarily believe in the quarterback we have in our roster right now, or if we draft a quarterback but we believe he needs to wait a year and you're the quarterback that we feel like should, start ahead of him. What I'm getting at is I think that Davis Mills, and I may be the only person on this train saying this, I think Davis Mills can benefit from staying with the Houston Texans because he's going to be a third-year quarterback. He's going to be a player who, again, will be in a much more comfortable, we presume, system that can allow quarterbacks to thrive, and he can learn in a system that allows that quarterback to play some of that modern, up-to-date football. And if your rookie quarterback, God forbid, get hurt, something happens, or you may need to pull him out so he can see things differently from the sidelines than on
Davis
the field,
Mills did.
like Davis Mills, then Davis Mills, a quarterback who's already on this team, has been playing with some of the guys that will be on this team, next season, can step in and fill in their shoes. So I'm against it. And my thing is, do we want an older backup quarterback for this rookie quarterback? Like, I don't think switching out quarterbacks would do any justice because Davis Mills can also teach this young quarterback some of the same things you bring in a vet to teach. So let's cut that out. Again, I think I'm in a minority on that one, but I think Davis Mills and Houston should not move on from one another. And by the way, he is a third-round quarterback still on his rookie deal. It's cheap. Let's save money and cut corners where we can do that. Davis Mills needs to continue to be on the Houston Texans roster.
And before moving on, John, I do want to give you some credit really quick. I love how you talked about the importance of coaching because I do believe, and I think this is the majority of Texans fans now, I do believe the lack of coaching he has had through the first two seasons is part of the reason why he has struggled so bad. I mean, the first season, David Culley and Tim Kelly, you already know how that went. And then this past season, you thought it was going to be better with Lovie Smith, especially with Pep Hamilton. And like I mentioned, unfortunately, he regressed. So I'm still rooting for Davis Mills. I hope he finds success, if not here in Houston, somewhere in the NFL, because I can see the potential is there, but something has to click. And whether that's coaching, whether that's confidence, whether that's just him getting his skills to the NFL level, because you got to remember that I want to say this year with him starting, how many games he started? Like 15 games, because he was benched for those two. This is probably the most football he played consistently since what? High school. Because the first year in college he set out due to the knee injury. The second year, the first 2 years, towards the end of his sophomore campaign, he came back and only played, I think it was 3 games. Then there was the COVID year where he only played like 3. He gets drafted to the Texans. We all know the history. So this was literally the first time that he played consistent football, ever since high school. So, regardless of what goes on, man, I'm still rooting for Davis Mills. And, let's see what the future holds for him. I'm not giving up on him. I know it hurts. And trust me, I am hurt because I wanted to talk some noise.
You are alone. Thank you guys for checking out today's episode of the Locked On Texans podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Locked On Texans and subscribe on YouTube as well under the name Locked On Texans.
And as always, I'm your host, Cody M. Davis. Please remember to follow me on Twitter at CodyDavis_24. Once again, it's Cody COTYDAVIS_24. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, peace.